Okay, so I'm Andy Agathangelo, very proud to be the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a rather unusual organisation. We are a fast-growing international community of people dedicated to driving up the levels of transparency in the financial services sector. We are very focused on our mission. Our mission is to promote ongoing reform of the finance industry so that it serves society better. And our vision is to create a highly respected, and for me, those two words are extremely important, a highly respected international institution that is dedicated to ensuring that consumers are treated fairly by the sector. We think the work that we do is both noble and necessary, and we are rather flattered by the quantity and frankly the caliber of the people becoming involved with our mission and our vision. We have around 1,700 people in the UK who are part of the Transparency Task Force community, and we also have about 1,000 people outside the UK who are also getting involved with what we're trying to do. So we're an important group, we believe, and we're working extremely hard to make change happen. If the TTF was just a talking shop, if the TTF was just a talking shop, I really would, wrap it up tomorrow morning, because life's too short if to just spend time talking about issues. It's only because we are convinced we can and frankly are making a difference that gives me the enthusiasm I have for continuing to do what we do. We've already become the secretariat to 2 all-party parliamentary groups. We've already had 2 inquiries opened by the British government. Last month, we submitted our first ever non-UK regulatory consultation to a piece of work in the USA. So there's all sorts of good, energetic things happening. Some of them you'll be hearing about today. Okay, so we're going to get things moving. I'm going to start off with just share my screen in relation to a couple of points. The first thing I'm going to show you folks, and I know that some of you are aware of this already, the first thing I'm going to show you is Violation Tracker. Violation Tracker is a database that captures violations by different organizations in the USA. So it's a database that captures infringements in the USA. And to be a little bit more specific, if you click on this bit here, which you might see on the left, agency data sources, you will immediately see a very, very long list of the different sources of information that populate this amazing database. It really is amazing. I'm a huge fan of it. There are 444,000 plus bits of information in this database, and it's basically hoovering up, very manually, by the way. There's no massive tech involved here. Literally a lot of keying in information into a keyboard. They hoover up all this information from all these different government and federal agencies in the USA, and they're also capturing data in local agencies as well. And what you can do with the database is you can actually search with it, and that's a pretty cool thing to do, because what you can do is search, for example, by industry type. And look what happens if you click on this bit, industry totals. You come to a table, and the table is showing you folks the level of fines against different industries. And it may or may not surprise you to know that financial services is the worst infringing industry by a long way. In fact, by such a long way, it's 7 times-ish worse than the second worst offending industry, which is pharmaceuticals. Third is oil and gas, fourth is motor vehicles, etc. You can probably see it for yourself. I think the maths works out that the top 7 or 8 industries, even added together, aren't as bad as financial services. And this to me is very, very important, because a great deal of the work that the Transparency Task Force does is about trying to understand the trust deficit. Why is it that so many people are distrusting of the financial services sector? What is it that causes the malpractice, the malfeasance, the misconduct, the mis-selling that leads to the figures we're looking at? And I genuinely think that anybody in the sector ought to be concerned about this data. Let's not stick our head in the sand. Let's not turn a blind eye to it. Let's face what we are facing, and let's ask ourselves the difficult, challenging questions. Why is it that the financial services sector scores so badly in this particular chart and many, many other alternative ways of measuring things like infringements and trustworthiness, etc.? And of course, you know where this is going. I personally believe that part of the problem is around the topic of culture. That's why we're talking about culture. We're asking ourselves the question, how could we help to fix the culture in financial services with a view to improving the way the industry operates? Now, what's really interesting to me about the very low levels of trust within the sector is that of all the industries out there, the one industry that is completely dependent on being trusted is financial services. Yeah, we deal with intangible ideas that are basically built around some kind of a promise. If I do this, you'll do that. I promise to pay the bearer the sum of, etc., etc. So the entire financial system literally is built on the idea that it has credibility, that it can be trusted, despite the fact that financial services has to be trusted to succeed and to flourish and to function. There is a mountain of evidence to suggest there's something very, very untrustworthy about it. And when you dig a little bit deeper, as I'm literally going to do now, I'll click on financial services and dig into the detail a little bit further. We get the top 10 worst offending companies in the USA. This is a very USA orientated database, but I'll come back to that point in a moment. We get the top 10 of worst offenders. We get Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, etc., etc. Wells Fargo, I'll quickly mention Wells Fargo because Wells Fargo was the organization I was doing some research for in relation to the book that we published last year. It was doing that research that led me to find this database, and I've been a fan of it ever since. But if you scroll down further on the page, you see information that is really disturbing, really disturbing. There's a word called recidivism. I didn't know the word recidivism until about this time last year when I stumbled across Violation Tracker and the people that run it talked to me about this issue. Recidivism is the idea that somebody might do something wrong. It could be a person, could be an organization. They get caught, they get told off, fined, penalized, whatever it might be, but they carry on doing it. They carry on doing it. And that's what we've got here, ladies and gentlemen. The data is telling us that the financial services sector has a predisposition to carry on doing the things that it does wrong. And that's the big issue. That's why we are convinced that culture has a big part to play in this. And just to kind of qualify my point here, if you scroll down this table, what you'll basically see is the same kind of organizations doing the same things over and over again. It really does ask big questions. One of the questions it asks is, well, if the purpose of the regulator is to make sure that everyone's playing fairly and that the market's safe and people can trust it, is the regulatory framework working? This would simply suggest not. This would simply suggest not. You have to ask yourself the question, well, what are the incentives inside these organizations that are causing this level of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, mis-selling? Big, big questions. Now, we haven't got a hope in hell tonight of getting to all the answers, but what we can do, of course, is we can start to think about the sorts of things that can potentially make a difference. And I'm going to quickly jump to one further quick idea just to share this particular point with you about oaths. Now, there's a school of thought that basically suggests that people who make a professional commitment by way of a Hippocratic Oath, for example, in the medical profession, when they make the Hippocratic Oath, it means something. It's an absolute promise, a professional commitment to not do any harm and do all the other good things that the medical profession do. So there's a very, very strong argument to say that given there's obviously some kind of conduct problem in the financial sector, maybe a small part of the solution could be some kind of an oath. So with that in mind, There are some very, very good oaths being used in different parts of the world. There's one in Australia, which we know very well. We know the people that run it very well. The banking and finance oath people in Australia are absolutely superb. They've developed a wonderful oath, which is being adopted by many, many great organizations in Australia. And we're having conversations with them about maybe what they should do is have a more kind of global perspective. There's another one in Holland, where it's actually mandatory. In Holland, you cannot join the banking profession unless you take their oath. It's compulsory. Maybe we should have something similar. So we've given some thought in our group that's dealing with this issue. We've given some thought to what the ideal characteristic should be, and that's what we've got written down here. The oath itself captures everything that we think to be quite important. We're not suggesting it's by any way the kind of the end result. It's not perfect at all, but it definitely is a step in the right direction, and you can read it there. In case it's too small, I'll read it out for you. And the idea is this would be the global finance oath. Maybe we can get to a point 3, 5, 10, 20 years from now where everybody that enters the finance industry makes some kind of professional commitment. This currently says, and I say currently because it's all up for discussion. If you want to be involved in the project group, by the way, that's involved with developing this oath, just put the word oath into the chat and we'll make sure that we invite you to attend the next meetings, etc. Just put the word oath in the chat and we'll know what that means. I'll read it out. It says, as a financial services professional, I hereby commit by way of this solemn professional oath that I shall always act in an ethical, transparent, and trustworthy manner, and I shall accept the consequences if I do not. I recognize that my own conduct influences the behavior of others, and I know it's my professional duty to expose any wrongdoing that I encounter. Now, we think this is a pretty good start, but it's by no means finished. The bit I'm highlighting because of its relevance to culture. There are many clever ways of defining culture, but essentially it's about what is deemed to be the kind of the normal conduct, normal behavior. And of course, every individual's conduct, every individual's behavior has an influence on the people around them. And the question we're asking tonight is, why is the culture of the financial services sector as it is? How does that contribute to the sorts of issues we're talking about, and what can we do about it? And I'm simply positioning the idea that maybe an oath can play a small part in the solution side of this equation. That's why we've got the line in here. I recognize that my own conduct influences the behavior of others. I recognize that my own conduct influences the behavior of others. It's a reminder that not only are we responsible for our own actions, but we have to be mindful of the fact that what we do affects others. And of course, and I'm sure you know where this is going already, this is especially true of our leaders. Yeah, our leaders, the leaders of the financial services sector, have a particularly big responsibility, we believe, to be good examples. As simple as that, to be good examples to others. Some of you may know that we have a great big project on the go. It's the International League of Ethical Financial Services Leaders. We've now got 7 founder members. We've got 5 Brits, 1 gentleman from Nepal, and 1 gentleman from the USA. One lady of one of the British people is a lady. This is going to become a global network of the good leaders in the financial services sector, the ones who know the difference between right and wrong, care about that difference enough to actually influence the world around them, and like the idea of working collaboratively with like-minded leaders around the world. It's a hugely, hugely exciting project. We've written a manifesto for the International League of Ethical Financial Services Leaders. I'm scrolling through it now. Again, if this is of any interest to you, just put the word leaders into the chat and I'll make sure that we follow up with the information that you'll need. It's a particularly exciting project. There are some great quotes in this manifesto. I'm going to read out a couple. Perhaps my favorite, Abraham Lincoln. It's a bit sexist in terms of it being old, by the way it references men, but just put that to the side for the moment. It says, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. Now that to me is a really powerful quotation. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. There's a wonderful Elvis Presley one, good old Elvis. Values are like fingerprints. Nobody's are the same, but you leave them all over everything that you do. I could talk at length about all these topics, but I'm not going to. What I'm going to do now is pass over to Alexandra, my colleague, our head of events, who does an amazing job organising a huge number of events through our calendar each month, each year. And then we're going to go to our first speaker, Mr. John Dashfield, who I'm especially pleased is with us tonight, who's going to be sharing some very important insights about the inner self and why it matters, and how we need to understand what's going inside us to really understand what's driving our behaviour. So we'll get to John in a couple of minutes, but first of all, we're going to go to Alexandra to deal with some housekeeping points. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, evening everyone. I'm Alexandra, head of events at TTF. So just a few things to go through. First of all, as Andy mentioned at the start, we are recording this event, and we will be uploading it to our YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. So if there's anything you regret saying or you don't want us to include, please send me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat, and we can make sure we edit it out. We also, obviously with the chat, like Andy said, I will be circulating all the notes put in the chat in a follow-up email tomorrow. Obviously won't include any private messages sent to me or Andy, but everything else will be circulated to all the attendees. We also would greatly appreciate it if you could help us. If you have Twitter and like tweeting, you could help us by tweeting during the event. I'll put our Twitter handle and some hashtags in the chat as well that you can use. I think that's everything.
That is everything, Alexandra. Thank you very much. Now, just before we go to Mr. John Dashfield, who I can see is raring to go, just before we get to John, I'm going to invite, we haven't got time to do this for everybody, I hope you understand, but I'm going to invite everybody that's new to TTF, where this is your first ever event, to introduce yourselves. I can see one or two folks who I know are brand new to TTF meetings. We're going to start off with Campbell Fleming. Campbell actually hosted an event we had at Aberdeen Standard a few years ago, but it's the first time that Campbell's been with us on one of our Zoom events. So Campbell, if you wouldn't mind, please do take yourself off mute and just say hello quickly to everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. Hello all. I'm Campbell Fleming. I was until recently the Global Head of Distribution at Stand Life Aberdeen, and I'm having a period of rest in the garden, but chairing the big exchange, which is an industry initiative to help people invest with impact and also address issues like financial inclusion and exclusion, which is pretty critical. And thanks for joining, Andy, and more power to your elbow, to you and your team.
Thank you very much indeed, Campbell. Campbell, feel free to put the URL for the big exchange into the chat. We know that many of our members will be interested in a stock exchange that's designed to basically help promote good companies, good conduct, companies that look after the planet, etc. Feel free to do that if you'd like to, Campbell. Great to have you with us. Mr. Anthony Smith, who I spoke to for the first time this morning, early doors. Anthony, nice and briefly for me, please introduce yourself. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Anthony Smith, worked in the industry for 30 odd years. I used to work with Paul Moore, and hence our contact, and I was the HBOS whistleblower that was referenced in his book Crash Bank Wallop. And the last 15 years or so I've been a freelance compliance consultant.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Anthony's got a lot of interesting stories, he really does. Mr. Phil Tolhurst, who I believe has been introduced to us through John Dashfield, if I've got that right. Phil, please take yourself off mute as you've done and tell us a little bit about yourself. Phil, thank you.
Hi everyone. You are quite right. My name is Phil Tolhurst. I'm a financial planner. I've done some training with John in the past, and whatever John sends me each week is generally pretty interesting, and I got an invite to this, so I thought, well, let's log on and see what it's all about.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for being here. Great stuff. Mr. Chris Goodchild, I think you're brand new to TTF as well. I can see your nod. Chris, if you can, take yourself off mute and say hi. Thank you.
Hi, I was introduced by Francisca Self, who some of you might know or might not. Yeah. I'm a self-investor more than anything. I haven't got an industry pedigree or anything like that. but I was involved in the LCS scandal, so I have some views about that.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Chris. We're now going to go to Roger Mullen. Roger, it's lovely to have you with us. Please say hello nice and briefly for me.
Hi there, Andy, and hi there, everybody. I'm Roger Mullen. I'm a former Member of Parliament. I've got a long-standing interest in ethics, and I feature briefly in Ian Fraser's book Shredded about the Royal Bank of Scotland.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And I think Lee or Leah Hurlin might be brand new. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. But either way, please introduce yourself, Lee or Leah. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I have actually been to some of the meetings as well, but it has been a few years. So I work in finance as well for the last 5 years, and more on the regulatory side. But because I'm not necessarily representing that tonight, it's more just me who's just really interested in definitely cultural reform.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Great. Well, John Dashfield's going to be speaking in just a moment. If you've dialed in, I can't tell your name, so please do let me know in the chat if you're brand new to TTF, and of course I'll be very pleased to provide a chance for you to introduce yourselves. We're now going to go to John Dashfield. John has been a wonderful support of the Transparency Task Force. He's been providing superb coaching support to me and the team, helping us with strategy and so on. John has, I believe, a really important perspective on, if you like, getting to the heart of the matter. And I'll let John pick up from there. Thank you very much for being with us, John. Over to you.
Right, good evening, everyone. Yeah, really good to be here with a lovely group of like-minded people. So I believe I've got about 10 minutes. Great. Okay, so what I want to do is take a look at the problem, what causes the problem, and how change actually happens. And I've got a kind of a different perspective on this. But so what's the problem? So to me, it looks like it's a willful lack of transparency. And I say willful because we're talking about an intentional lack of transparency in significant segments of the financial services business. And that behaviour, or the result of that behaviour, is that it disadvantages the customer and the client. And what that results in, as Andy's already pointed out, is a lack of trust in financial services. And as some of you may know, the annual Edelman Trust Barometer, I think, has demonstrated that financial services and banking has been the lowest trusted sectors in business for a very long time. So what's the outcome we want? Well, we want a financial services sector that serves society. We want customer and client-centric behaviour, and ultimately to gain the trust back of the public that the industry serves. So what is the problem fundamentally? So you have to appreciate that all problems come from the human mind, right? And the unhealthy state of financial services is really a result of the unhealthy states of mind and unhealthy thinking of significant numbers of people in the industry. So people who willfully disadvantage others in order to feather their own nests and in order to for their own gain, they're feeling insecure. All of these problems, all of the behaviours that disadvantage people and the lack of transparency emanates from an insecure feeling. Now, I'm using insecurity as a sort of catch-all term for fear. So greed is insecurity. Fear is insecurity. A lack of transparency is the result of insecurity. A lack of empathy. See, when people get, not everybody by a long shot, but some people, when they feel insecure and they feel frightened, they've got a base of fear, their behaviour is coming from fear, that's their feeling state, then they lack empathy. So it's a lack of empathy. In other words, when this lack of transparency is going on and people are being disadvantaged, there is a lack of empathy in the perpetrators of that. They're unable to imagine, or they brush aside how it's going to affect the person at the end of it, or on the receiving end of it. So selfish behaviour is insecurity. Now, I've been a huge fan of the psychologist George Pransky. I've been a client of George Pransky. George has been called the most important psychologist of the 20th century. And George Pransky said, insecurity is the generic human mental illness. So you can see that all of the problems, not only in financial services, but outside of that, that humans face really have their root in insecurity. Okay. So when we get on to culture, so what is culture? So there's many definitions. I wrote a blog on this a couple of years ago, and I researched it. So what is culture? And there's loads and loads of different definitions. You know, it's often defined as the behaviours, the beliefs, the values, the vision, the environment of an organisation. But ultimately, it's really something more fundamental than that. And I would call it it's really the collective state of mind of an organisation. So whether that be a one-person organisation or 10,000 people, it's the collective state of mind in the moment. And if that state of mind is fear, then you're quite likely, or that creates an environment where people are going to potentially do things, you know, that disadvantage other people. Not all the time, but it creates that environment where. So a self-serving culture is fueled by fear, by greed, by insecurity, and it's kind of been mentioned already. But if you look at some of the sort of famous or infamous perpetrators, you know, people like Adam Applegarth, Fred Goodwin, more recently Neil Woodford. What you'll find is that these people they've got monstrous egos, and they're very insecure people. You know, the behaviour that they exhibited and was fueled by their insecurity. Okay. So what we find is that in leadership positions all over financial services, there are very, very bright, clever people, and yet they're very insecure. Now, I looked up another recent example. Is there was a situation with Barclays Bank more recently about the CEO, Jeff Staley, going after one of the whistleblowers. See, now you would find that, again, that's fueled by insecurity, his insecurity, and they just gave him a fine, and I believe he's still in his job. Now, how is a culture formed? Well, yes, the leaders set the tone for sure, and yet I believe it's more than about just the leader. It's fueled by this, which I'll come on to in a minute. It's fueled by insecurity. Now, if you had an insecure leader of an organisation, and yet the whole workforce felt secure in themselves, I would say that you wouldn't get the behaviours that you know that we're talking about. So it's not just the leader, it's bigger than that. And I've got lots of, I mean, time doesn't permit, but I've got some fabulous examples of this, where if we had some more time, it would be quite easy to illustrate. So ultimately, the problem is what I would call misunderstanding. So the fundamental problem in humanity at the moment is the misunderstanding that circumstances cause feelings. Okay, so what
what's going on with people is that they have a belief that the way they feel, good or bad, is a result of their circumstances, and that's just not true. It's psychologically not true, and yet the prevailing paradigm in humanity is that's true. And all the time that this false paradigm prevails, what we're going to do is really we're just going to keep seeing the same behaviours repeated over and over again. So the ultimate solution is for people to learn how the mind functions. I've been teaching, coaching, training this for a decade, over a decade now. And how it looks to me is we have the understanding to do it. So we have the understanding. And a point I wanted to make is that it's not that what we're doing isn't useful in terms of trying to combat the lack of transparency, but ultimately you can't fight fire with fire. See, you cannot transcend fear by using fear, right? And this is why I personally believe that regulation will not change the situation appreciably. I mean, it might just deal with a few problems, but ultimately it's not gonna change it, because I mean, it's a very famous quote by Albert Einstein, and Einstein said, you can't solve a problem on the same level of thinking that created the problem, you see. And really what he was saying is that in the state of mind in which the problem exists for people, it's inconceivable that people are going to get the thinking that will help them transcend the problem, right? So it's really a consciousness problem that we've got, rather than, so see, the result is a lack of transparency. Where does that come from? It comes from people's behavior. Where does people's behavior come from? It comes from how they feel. Where does how they feel come from? It comes from their thinking. You can't separate thought and feeling. And this is where the problem exists. This false paradigm where people believe, so if you take something like greed, which is insecurity, you know, greed is really the belief that there's a lack and there's not enough to go around, and I need to get as much as I can, as fast as I can, and to hell with the consequences, right? That's what greed is. Well, see, what people are trying to do is make themselves feel good by acquiring lots of money. Now, but it's never going to work, because the human mind does not work like that, because external circumstances do not create internal feelings. So it's a misunderstanding. But all the time that the misunderstanding exists, we're going to keep butting up against the same problem over and over. And the solutions that we've got at the moment are kind of remedial, in the sense that it's not that they're not useful and we shouldn't do them, but ultimately it's a change in thought, it's a change in people's state of mind that will ultimately bring the biggest change. And we have the technology to do it. And it's been around for quite a long time. And the last thing I want to mention, because I'm just noticing the time, if anyone wants to look it up, there's a book called Modelo. Now, this book was written by a guy called Jack Pransky. He's related to George Pransky. It's about 20 years ago. And this book won the Martin Luther King Storytellers Award 20 years ago for the book best exemplifying Dr. King's vision of a beloved community. Now, essentially, long story short, Modelo was or is a housing project in America which had the absolute worst of humanity in it: murders, shootings, abuse, violence, drug problem. I mean, it made a British council estate look like a holiday camp. This place, and one man, Roger Mills, went in there on his own, and over a period of time, he began to teach people and share very casually. But he began to teach, he identified who the community leaders were, and he began to share this understanding of state of mind with people. And in over a 3-year period, which is why the book's written, the crime, the murder rate dropped to nil. It became a much more integrated community. The community themselves kicked all the drug dealers out. It wasn't perfect, but I went to a conference a few years ago, and there was a guy from the United Nations there who said that the results that they got through this understanding were way more than anything that had been achieved by the United Nations ever before. So we have the technology to do it.
John, thank you very, very much. You've really kicked things off superbly. Very thought-provoking, very introspective. You've helped us see the connection between the kind of the inner self, that sense of I haven't got enough, I need more, I don't feel safe, manifesting in the kind of behavior that's an attempt to get all the things that will make you feel safe and make you will feel like you've got enough, but of course in the process ruining things around you. Thanks so much, John, for getting things off to such an interesting start. Shane Norman put something in the chat, which Shane, can you unmute and elaborate on your comment, because I found it very interesting. I'll read it out. Shane says, the egotistic manager culture is fostered by the financial media, by IFAs, Citywire, etc., through their obsession with star managers. Can you talk to us about that, Shane, and connect it to the points, please, that John has just been talking about? Thank you.
Yeah, this really comes out of work I did many years ago on rating investment managers, not the funds, not the people, but the companies, the producers. And really what we came up with was some sort of measure of culture, pretty rough, but nonetheless a sense of what John has been talking about. In other words, the sense that of insecurity, the sense of inward looking, not looking out to the people that they deal with, not, as he said, not having empathy, as you say. But it's also something which is, well, it's part of human nature for one thing, but that is also reflected in the whole structure of our financial system. The makers themselves, the producers, the fund managers, the people who analyze them, comment upon them in the media, in ratings agencies, Morningstar, and so on and so forth. And this promotion of a star culture of managers, you know, Woodford, of course, was a prime example, but there have been many, many more, Madoff and so on, and you go back through time. And again and again and again, management companies, investment management companies don't fail because the team gets the strategy wrong. You know, they all get it wrong from time to time, even stars must fail. And what makes them a star, of course, is that they come back. But then everybody focuses on the people, on the individuals who are doing this, which of course gratifies those individuals, overcomes their fear, makes them feel good, gives them money. And of course the company that employs them also benefits. So the whole thing works on a wheel, goes round and round and round, of the managers making money, the clients making money, the press getting onto this, making headlines out of it, usually at the very top of their performance. And so it becomes a self-feeding phenomenon. And it is extremely difficult to get to the roots of this and undo it. I mean, we could turn Christian here and say we must all love one another. And I would go with that, frankly. But how are we going to get that to work? And how are you going to get it to work in plain language, lay terms?
Thank you very much indeed, Shane. This is great. I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see you all in little thumbnails. Just wave a hand at me if you'd like to chip in with a comment or a question. Just please do. Just wave if you'd like to do something at this point. Ed Tuhig. Ed, please unmute, introduce yourself, tell us all where you are and get straight to your point, sir. Thank you very much, Ed.
Ed Tuhig in Nova Scotia, Canada. And I've been interested in the economy and the culture of the last 50 years. And I've always wondered which is cause and which is effect. Is the culture what caused us to go into this terrible economic problems we've developed in the last 50 years? Or is it the other way around? I think it's a mixture of both, but I did want to make this one point. there's a database of all the books that have been published over a period of time in the United States, I believe only, but maybe it's wider than that. And this is data can be researched. The research was done to determine the number of times that the word we and the word I were used over this period of time of the last 100 years or so. And it was quite striking that up until the 1970s, it was usually we was the largest number of uses. Wow, and after that, it was I that became the most used of the two. And that, I think, is a significant indication of that overlap between the economic changes and the society and cultural changes that have taken over the last same period of time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ed. That's a really interesting point. And you're making me think about the iPhone, the iPad, the I this, the I that. Maybe things are just developing such that everyone's getting a bit more kind of self-centric. I don't know if I've just made that word up, but I'm sure you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. Thank you, Ed. That was really interesting. Anybody else would like to chip in with a comment here? Anybody else? Mr. Robert Downall, I'm going to draw you into this conversation, sir, because I know that you are, as you know, I know you're so knowledgeable on all these sorts of areas. Could you talk to us on your perspective on what John was saying about the importance of the inner self and how this sense of kind of insecurity and anxiety and fear manifest in poor conduct? Anything you'd like to share about that, Robert? Thank you.
Yeah, no, sure, I can. I mean, I think I agree with him that, of course, it's a collective endeavor. I sort of refer to, simply put, organizational cultus as the collective psychology of an organization. But so you can't exclude the developmental axis of the human being on one level. So if you take Keegan's stages of development, we are all kind of moving towards some form of self-actualization. Not many leaders get there. That's an important point, of course. And the same would go what Jung would call individuation process. So if you look at what we call the relationship between myself and the other, or the subject and the object, so the capacity of understanding what is outside of ourselves and how our behavior influences the outside of ourselves, that is a form of, that's a developmental axis in its own right. So leaders have to kind of get on some kind of developmental journey to get to a stage where they understand that culture is normed and formed and created by their sort of consciousness that they have in terms of behavior and actions and all the various operational sides that come with that they are empowered to embody in organizations. And that is very often missed. So when I've spoken to leaders about culture in banks and organizations, you know, don't mention psychology or don't mention the word culture. They believe they understand it because from a digital linear thinking perspective, it seems very intuitive to understand. So I sort of half jokingly would call that, you know, culture or organizational psychology is intuitive to understand, but then of course very, very difficult to change and implement. That's the sort of the paradox, because for a linear digital thinker who spent a lot of time and intellectual capacity understanding the linearity of the world, it's easy then to replicate. It's very difficult to understand and know, but then easy to implement. So it's the opposite. So culture is often misinterpreted in that way. And I've spoken to many banks about how you measure culture and how you would be working with culture, both strategically and tactically. And very, very difficult to get through to that point where they understand that this is actually a developmental stage in an organization. I have to help and try as a leader to create rather than staying exactly where they are. So that's been my experience with it. But absolutely spot on, John. I mean, it's that developmental for the self first, but then also for the organization. So you have to change the organization through this regeneration process at the same, at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Really, really great to hear your thoughts as well. Folks, we're going to be moving on shortly, but of course, what we'd all like to do now, I'm sure, is to thank John Dashfield for opening the session up for us. John, can you please take your appreciation from all of us? Thank you very much indeed, John. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Good stuff.
Thanks
Good
a
stuff.
lot.
Good stuff. And I think I just missed Anne-Marie putting her hand up. Anne-Marie, quickly squeeze your point in, and then we're going to go to Mr. Andy Aitkenhead. Anne-Marie, get your point in. Go for it.
Yes, I seem to come back to the same thing all the time. Andy will know. You know what I'm going to say. It seems to me that the education system that we have is increasing the problem all the time, and unless we actually change it, because it makes the new generation, it makes everybody very insecure. It doesn't actually build confidence enough because it's not looking at people's talents. And I think as long as we have the conception that self-interest is in opposition to collective interest, we're not going to get very far. And I think that's where the insecurity comes from.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne-Marie. There's a lot of food for thought in just those last few sentences from Anne-Marie. Mr. Dashfield, thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed that. I'm sure everybody else did as well. Let's go straight to Mr. Andy Aitkenhead. He's going to come at it from a different perspective. But like John Dashfield, I'm very pleased to say Andy is a tremendous friend of the Transparency Task Force. I think you all realise this. We can't do what we do without all the volunteer support we have from many folks. And Andy's a really good example of somebody who's giving a lot of time and effort into TTF, giving us so many ideas and so many insights. Wonderful to have you with us, Andy. Please do take the floor and go for it. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and good evening, everybody, or whatever time it is. Good afternoon, good morning, where you are. So John and I knew we were going to be covering similar ground. I think what I have to say complements what John's said. There is actually quite a well-known quote, some of you may have heard it, from a chap called Bill O'Brien, the late Bill O'Brien, who was CEO of Hanover Insurance, who said something along the lines that the success of any change initiative was wholly dependent upon the inner state of the person leading the change. So it's interesting in terms of thinking about that inner state. So I guess my interest in culture goes back a long way. I've been in financial services about 40 years, initially on the trading side, but over the last 20 years, I've been involved in leading change, I guess. A lot of it's been remediating change programs that have gone wrong. And the Transparency Task Force is about change. So we are trying to change the world in a way. I want to think about the change side of things on why that's significant. So just want to come back, over that period of time, as I said, I've worked on the remediation of lots of change initiatives. In the last, I guess, 6 or 7 years, we've done a lot of work in the area of innovation and the adoption of agile methods. I've been exposed to those for a much longer period, but because they've become extremely popular, particularly with large institutions, there have been lots of events. And one of the things I noticed 5 or 6 years ago, that whenever you went to these events, people would talk about culture, but they weren't talking about it in a good way. It was usually as an obstacle to change. So it's interesting that, you have this thing called culture. It's something that everybody knows makes a massive difference. But interestingly, when I talk to consultants about it, other consulting firms, they will always tell you, or mostly tell you, that it's extremely difficult to sell. It's difficult to execute, but of course it's behavioral. I guess maybe more significant is addressing behavioral issues. Many consulting endeavors seek to provide their customers with certainty. So they set out, and it looks good when you set out a sort of a neat plan. But of course, there are potential problems. One is that shit happens. Okay, so things happen that actually, and when we look at culture, we'll see why actually when that's, when things happen, when things go wrong, it's actually the human behavior, the human dynamics, which are the issue, never in the context of, say, technology-driven change. It's never the technology, it's always around the people. So what's going on? And John's put a finger on some of those issues. But I think the other thing that to say, there's another famous quote that what got you here won't get you there. So the way we behave at the moment doesn't move us forward. So what do we do actually? So in thinking about this these cultural issues, as it were, one of the things that I started to do was ask people what they meant by culture. And we I guess this is over the last 3 or 4 years, we identified 9 or 10 themes. And there were things like the legacy mindset, but also the hierarchical, directive or command and control type culture that's prevalent in most large corporations. And it's interesting that, you know, one of the I actually also for a brief period of time taught tennis years ago, or coached tennis, and I was a big fan of The Inner Game of Tennis, and it's a book that was, if you want, responsible for a lot of the methods that are used in the coaching industry. And Galway, who wrote it, in his book The Inner Game of Work, said when he actually got exposed to the corporate world, there were kind of 3 things that he noticed, and I'm sure you'll recognize them. One is that senior leaders, who are often the sponsors of change, see change as something that's done to other people, not that they're part of. The second thing was that actually people weren't resistant to change as much as resistant to the change process. And the third thing was that the command and control culture that was prevalent in most corporations was the thing that created the most resistance in terms of change. Now, you can all just think about this. When you're asked to do something or somebody discusses something with you, it's a lot easier to get to grips with it than when you're told to do something. So psychologically, when you're told, most people are quite resistant, and it comes, you know, we were like that as kids, weren't we? And that psychological issue remains, yet people still like telling other people what to do. So there's a challenge in that whole culture around when we get to addressing behavioural change. So what I want to do is, I don't want to, if anyone wants to talk about all the other elements of culture that we identified at some point later and wants more information, I'm happy to share that. And I'll put my email address in the chat later so you can hook up. Quite happy to share the work we did on that. But just in terms of thinking about this, these challenges to change and the things that we've done. So I said I've been involved in change for 20 years. I was very fortunate. The first time took over a program of change that was completely screwed up, it was for a large investment bank where they had a business program that was, everything that possibly could have gone wrong had gone wrong. And I actually sold the person I ended up working for the concept of coaching the team to deliver. What I later discovered was I'd combined what I'd say is non-directed coaching with a concept which I didn't realize at the time, but is common sense, which is often referred to as action learning. And action learning is essentially a collaborative process where you get people together around a problem and effectively ask the questions to get the problem solved. So thinking about, one of the issues you need to do in these kind of contexts is to frame the problem correctly in the first place, so to understand what problem we're trying to solve. So there are things that we need to do, because if we continue with the directive cultures that we have, there are a number of things that they do, and John talked about fear, and fear is one of the outcomes, but it's part of a number of other things that occur. And there is actually a win-win to moving away from this. And let me just explain. So if you think about what happens when you're in a directive, if you want, command and control environment, it does a number of things, which it actually reduces, it reduces cognitive diversity. So it lowers the potential, the number of potential outcomes to a situation. So it works against innovation. Yet innovation is at the top of most banks' agendas at the moment, or most large financial services organizations' agendas. It lowers the level of transparency. And why does it do that? Because it lowers trust. And so what happens is that there is a fear, and this is one of the elements of fear, there is a fear of passing bad news back up. So when the shit or the crap happens, as it were, messengers are often frightened of giving that news to people in senior roles. It actually also lowers levels of accountability, people being, if you want, essentially frightened to take ownership. And I've seen this in well-known organizations. So cultures become toxic, but they don't actually necessarily need to be horrible places. They can actually, I was talking to somebody this morning and he said he's working in it's an associate of ours, he's working in a very nice environment, but it actually is toxic because he was telling me about, actually, they just fired somebody because he made a mistake. This is a relatively senior person. You know, so it's like people are very nice to one another and it seems all, all well and good, but actually it's not a psychologically safe space to be. So underlying this is this, if you want, is, cultures of fear. Now, there may not be, as I said, people quaking in their boots. And that's one of the things we need to change. It actually has an impact on personal as well as organizational performance. And it doesn't just work at, if you want, the general workforce level, it works at the leadership level. There's a lady called Pippa Grange, who just, I think last year published a book where she talks, I think it's called Fear Less, but she talks about working with leaders who are actually frightened, very successful, but frightened. And it's interesting in terms of the context, and it's part of that insecurity that John was talking about. And because they're frightened, I remember coaching the COO of one investment bank over a decade ago. I think in the second coaching session, he said to me, "This is confidential, isn't it?" Of course, I said, "No, I'm just posting every note on LinkedIn." But no, so, and he said what he couldn't talk to his peers or his, or other people at a senior level in the organization about some of the issues he was facing. There was a fear of actually being open about the problems that he was facing. And so having, as it were, me there to bounce that off was a critical help to him. So you get that. It's not, it's not just because people are directives that people below fear. There's a fear at the top, and the fear then becomes of taking ownership. So accountability is a problem. Transparency is a problem because people are not sharing openly the things that they have. So we have to get to a point where we have psychologically safe environments where people can be open and transparent. And it's a long-term thing. So, a culture program, as it were, a culture change program isn't a 6-month or a 1-year endeavor. It's interesting that John talked about the Modelo initiative and 3 years. And there's some research from the Human Performance Institute that talks about individual changing in behavior, that it actually takes about 4 months to embed changes in behavior into an individual. So if you think about it at an individual level, then the complexity of an organizational level, it's got to take a long time, and you've got to take the long view. And as a kind of addendum to that, one of the organizational challenges we saw to innovation agility was in financial services was the annual budget cycle. And actually there are a number of issues, the way it's actually negotiated, the fact that people want to see certainty around what's delivered inside a year, and there's very little time horizon beyond a year. And you find that when organizations try to plan more strategically and longer, those initiatives get derailed because people think they can just push all the deliveries out to the future, and because nothing happens or very little happens, then they get cancelled. So those sorts of things that become problematic. So what about the solution then? Obviously, it's got to be long-term. It's got to have some very clear senior level sponsorship. But in terms of the techniques we've used at the team level, which have actually been highly successful, highly engaging, I mentioned that the coaching initiative, but combined with action learning, so you're working with groups, but also there's some other tools that we use, and one of those is what we call transposition. And I'd never heard it used by anybody else until last year, I think it was, somebody pointed out an architect's site, a Scandinavian architect's firm that used it essentially to get people to think differently. And the idea is aim to look at a problem from a completely different perspective. So you create effectively greater cognitive diversity, greater empathy by setting up exercises with people to look at a problem from a different perspective than their own. And we've done it across organizations with different teams. We've not done it across organizations yet, but it's perfectly feasible to do it. But it's something, those are things that are there as tools to use. So there are things we can do, but we mustn't, because something doesn't work in the short term, dismiss it. We have to think much longer term. This isn't there is no silver bullet, just like there's no silver bullet for the pandemic. Anyway, that's, I could talk for a lot longer. There's a load of other issues, but I think that's enough for the moment.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy, for your insights and sharing with us the sorts of things you're doing with your clients and contacts and have been over a long period of time. Great thoughts. We're going to go first of all to Rich, because Rich put into the chat a point he's made in the past, which I find very interesting. Rich, please do elaborate on your point about different communities having different cultures and different communities within organizations and so on. I think you folks will find that it's interesting. And Rich, please just briefly introduce yourself and tell everybody where you are. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm in the States, 30 years or so in the financial services industry across various different firms. And I actually do have a book in the final publishing cycle based on applied linguistics and using that to inform standards and regulation in financial services, which is where some of this, my commentary comes from, because language is defined by communities. And what's community? But I mean, John referred to it earlier also as something that shares culture, people, processes, right? And everybody who's talked and the comments have always focused on the individual and organizations, right? So we're looking at the banks and a banking organization, but we're not considering the other communities within financial services, which have their own culture. So if you look at front office versus back office, those are two distinct communities, not tied to any single organization, that have distinct cultures amongst themselves. They belong to different organizations, and we do tend to talk about traders, right? Traders are stateless in regards to organizations when we talk about their behavior, because it doesn't matter if they're Goldman or Merrill Lynch, right? They're a trader, right? And we prescribe certain behaviors upon them. So looking at culture and trying to identify it for an organization may be too one-dimensional, because that culture, depending on the strength of the organization's leader or the size of the organization, could be overridden by other communities that those individuals belong to, whether it's they're in the retail side versus institutional, or equities versus fixed income cultures. So those kind of dynamics, I think when you talk about culture, you have to think more three-dimensional than just this sort of one-dimensional view of changing the culture of an organization, because you can do that, but still these other cultures persist and can affect how individuals behave, especially in regards to what we're trying to accomplish here.
Rich, thank you very much indeed for making those points. In a moment, I'm going to invite Susan Cuff to elaborate on what Susan put into the chat. But before Susan speaks to that point, if she'd like to, it's optional, of course. If you'd like to, Susan, that would be great. I want to share with you all some experience I had in the early part of my career. So I became a trainee financial advisor on the 18th of August, 1986. So pre-regulation, it was rather like the Wild West, no rules. All that mattered really was how much money you made. You measured your self-worth by how much money you made. Everybody else was doing the same thing. And the idea of missing a target was like an anathema. It really was an anathema. The idea of missing a target was like you would never dream of doing that, because you would almost define yourself by how well you were doing against your target. It became like an overriding paradigm. And I worked in several organizations where it was impossible to fail honorably. Now, what I mean by that is this. I worked in organizations where if you failed, it was like failure in this context being not hitting your target. It was something to be ashamed of. You know, you carried an emotional burden if you were behind your target. It was you know, really very sales focused, unbelievably so. And you can just imagine, can't you, in that kind of environment, what people would do to cut corners, to hit targets and achieve what needed to be achieved. And I worked for 3 organizations where different kinds of sales pressures led the sales forces to do things they kind of knew they shouldn't have been doing. But they all did it because they didn't have the luxury of being able to fail with dignity, to fail with a sense of honor. You know, to not hit your target was like throwing away your ego, and no human being wants to do that. So it's almost as if the entire culture was engineered to program people to do whatever they want, but achieve the business, get the results in. I'm sure things have moved on tremendously positively since then, but in those days, it really was the Wild West, and kind of anything went. By the way, in all 3 instances where I observed bad behavior, I reported it, as you would, you know, a normal human being seeing something going wrong. If you cast your mind back to the oath I put into the chat at the beginning, it talked about, you know, it is my professional duty to alert when I observe malpractice. I really do think that's true, because if nobody tells the truth about what's really going on, these things, these cultural behaviors just manifest, and they manifest and they infest. It goes on and on and on. So I thought I'd share that. Susan, if you're happy to, please speak about your point about the worrying time that some people have around things like budget setting time and target setting time. And briefly, please introduce yourself, Susan, because then everybody will understand the perspective that you have as an executive consultant at the very top end of the market. Susan, over to you. You might be on mute, Susan. There we go. If you just take yourself off mute. There we go. Lovely.
Hello.
We can hear you loud and clear. Perfect. Go for it.
Hi. Sorry. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the intro. It's very flattering, Andy. I'm not that special. Anyway, I'm in the people business, so recruitment, talent management, people. So I see people's reactions to things like bonus time and budget time, obviously, you know, month in, month out. And my point really is a much broader one than the one I made, but I was attending a webinar today about board behaviours, the behaviours of boards. And a question I asked that didn't get answered, not nobody's fault, was why are boards so secretive? And I think the behaviours can be worrying for the organisation because they are conducted so often behind closed doors. And somebody mentioned budget as a catalyst for fear and it's true. The budget process is always conducted so secretively. I know, of course, there's a need. If you're a PLC, there's a limit to it. Of course, I understand that. But the way in which it's conducted is so important, and it can drive such fear through the organisation that, you know, will my job be safe? Will there be a job? Are we merging departments? If we're buying ABC company, and is that true, by the way? What's going to happen then? And all those issues are huge for people up and down the organisation. And that's really is a bigger point, because obviously that's a big cultural issue. But I just think boards should be more cognizant than they are about how that necessarily sometimes secret behaviour affects their people.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan. That's very insightful indeed. I'm going to draw Campbell Fleming into this, if I may. If you're happy to speak to this point, Campbell, because you're a chap who's had very senior positions in very large organisations. You've kind of seen it from that, you've had that boardroom perspective. Is there anything you'd like to share with us in terms of your understanding of culture and what to do to improve it in an organization. Is there anything you've ever done in the past that seemed to have made a difference? Any positives you'd like to share with us about how you think the sector could go about improving its culture? Thanks, Campbell.
Yeah, I must say, Andy, you know, I've listened deeply tonight, and I must say a couple of things sort of resonated with me and a couple sort of triggered me a bit. So,
yeah,
you know, having led senior organisations, insecurity is something I've probably never felt, but maybe I've got to go and reflect a bit tonight to see whether, you know, some of those things, you know, if that was the case. I was intrigued by your comment about calling for an oath, because I don't think an oath's going to help when you've got a regulated set of, you know, obligations that are backed by sanctions, one of the world's most well-resourced regulators, and, you know, a pretty hefty regime around compliance, self-certification, SMCR, and all that good stuff. Yeah. The command and control structure I'm quite fascinated by, because SMCR basically cements that into the whole pillars and foundation of regulation now. Right. In terms of what I was accountable for, what I could be held account for, and what I was expected to, you know, deliver. You know, on one level you could say, yes, it does drive fear. And, you know, you understood that, you know, here was a contract, not an oath, but a contract with your regulator and your shareholders to say you do things. I'm not sure we're really getting at the triangulation between clients, shareholders, regulators, and things of that nature. I was impressed by some of the comments about star cultures and you know, the way the press gets onto these things. I worked for Jez Staley. I found him to be a very impressive, decent person who did an awful lot to do for diversity and things at JP Morgan. I think he profoundly regrets looking into whistleblowing, and having been at a firm where whistleblowing was infrequent, but sometimes used by people in the employment dispute process, was quite interesting to be on the other side of that. So, you know, I suppose my point is here, this is a highly complicated area. Speaking to an Australian about culture is always a tough one. You know, being a lover of cricket and rugby, it was interesting to see the Australian Cricket Board pull out of the tour of South Africa at the very last moment, and then the Australian Rugby Union turn around and offer to host the Lions tour in Australia, because, you know, they've been doing that. So I just say it's a lot difficult than everyone expects. I was a former regulator, a barrister in Australia, and qualified as a solicitor here, so I do understand the concept of a personal oath as well as a professional regulation. It's a bloody difficult job leading. It's almost as difficult as being a parent. And I just say, I think forums like this are hugely helpful, because I think you're absolutely right. If you don't get culture right and bring client focus into firms and really live that and lead by example, I don't think we've got much of a chance to make a big difference. But there's a fascinating conversation tonight, and once again, I look forward to joining the next meeting. And sorry if I went on a bit there, but
that's very good of you, Campbell, to share your thoughts from your perspective. And yeah, I guess there is always two sides to it, and it must be difficult trying to turn big organisations around and not impose, but infuse a different kind of mindset, a different kind of culture to things. Let's go back to Andy with his comments. Andy, in a moment, I'll invite you to share any sort of final comments you'd like to, but does anybody have anything specific, any comment or question that they'd like to put to Andy? Kim, please introduce yourself. Kim's another person who's been wonderfully helpful to me and the TTF team in recent weeks and months. Kim, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, Kim Schweitzer, American by birth, and have been living in London for the past 10 plus years, and am helping Andy with some of the tasks he has for TTF right now, and am the founder of an organization called Time for Change London, looking at companies having a greater purpose than the only short-term profits, because I believe this is where our future needs to go, and also where especially the newer generations at work really want to embrace. And I was just interested in what Campbell was saying in terms of living and leading by example. And I think that's where we're really falling down today, is because, you know, when we look at some of the examples of people, and I'll say in quotes, getting ahead, and the behaviors of those people, there are few and far between the examples that are leading the headlines. And we're a culture right now of headlines, and not necessarily digging into the details below. And this is what's coming out. So, you know, I believe in terms of an oath, is an oath going to work? Well, I'd love it to be able to work, but unless the behaviors start to go in that direction, and where you see, you know, as Andy showed initially when we were looking at, you know, the fines, they continue to come from a regulatory perspective, but it's not necessarily working. So until we get those behaviors that we can actually see them working, and creating the kind of cultures and mindsets and, you know, actions, we're not going to be able to just use an oath. We need more.
Thank you very much indeed, Kim. I'm sure you're absolutely right. Great input, Kim. Mr. Andy Aikenhead, to yourself, please, to kind of sum up this piece for us, and then we'll move on to our next speaker, Mr. Paul Moxey. Andy, back to you.
Yeah, a couple of points. So I absolutely agree with Campbell that it is a complicated and challenging world we've got to deal with. And it's interesting, you know, I think Campbell mentioned about whether we should have an oath or not. And one of the things I would say I've noticed over the last 30 years is, you know, what we've seen is an increase in regulation, but we've actually seen an increase in delinquency, which is interesting. You know, when I was a trader, if somebody reneged on a trade, and it happened, I think 3 times that I can remember, I pulled the line. You know, it was that I remember one conversation, a guy rang me up and said, did I want anything? And I was actually being treated as a client at that point, actually working for a small Swiss bank. And I said, yeah, I'd like a price in a particular bond. And he read me as a seller, and he quoted the price down, and I said, I'll buy 2 million. And he said, I was only giving you a level. So that, and there's very clear etiquette in this world. You ask for a price, it's a traded price. You ask for a level, that's essentially a valuation. And I said, you've got 2 choices. We either do the deal and we carry on, or, you know, you can hang up and don't do the deal, but don't ever call me again. You've opened me up. And he hung up, and he called the next day, and I said, I told you, Matthew, go away. Don't ever call me again. And it was a big investment bank. And that's, you know, so that it was kind of an important element in self-regulation. Now the world's changed and moved on, and it's actually very difficult, you know, as it's got larger, it's got more electronic, more digital. That's a problem. I think the other thing, and Shane mentioned about the star culture, we've heard about that a couple of times. There's an interesting study that was done over 20 years in Silicon Valley by a couple of academics at Stanford, Barron and Hannon. And they looked over a 20-year period at different types of culture, and they identified 5 different types. Autocratic, bureaucratic, engineering, star, and commitment. I won't go through it all, but in terms of star culture, you can imagine what that was like. And interestingly, when they revisited these firms post the dot-com bubble bursting in the early noughties, the 2 cultures that had done best were the star culture and the commitment culture. But none of the commitment culture firms failed, and they'd actually done on average better than the star culture firms. And half the star culture firms failed. Now, the commitment culture firms were firms that actually essentially they identified a small number, 3 or 4, if you want, behavioral pillars, And they hired on the basis of people subscribing to those behaviors. And it's interesting that, you know, what we've seen, I think people ape behavior that they think leads to success, but actually on average, and it's interesting in the work that the Maturity Institute guys are doing on purpose. There is a study going on at the Judge Business School at the moment looking at purpose versus those organizations that, if you want, put shareholder value at the fore. And actually, nothing's been published, but preliminary, I gather, they're coming to the conclusion that those financial firms that put purpose at their heart are doing better than the ones that focus on shareholder value.
Wow, that's really interesting.
So,
Andy, that last point in particular is very interesting indeed, because it opens up the whole debate around short-term profit maximization, Friedmanite organizations that kind of are hardwired just to maximize share price, the whole kind of business roundtable conversation from a year or two ago about becoming more of a multi-stakeholder society, defining a purpose of an organization, all these really big topics. Andy, thank you very much indeed for sharing with us your thoughts. Let's show our appreciation to Andy Aitkenhead. Thank you very, very much indeed, Andy. Great to have you with us again tonight. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Okay, just before we go to Professor Paul Moxey, let us take a look at our event program. There's a particular reason why I'm sharing this with you. Something we kind of experimented with, and we really didn't know if it would work or not, is the TTF Film Club. Now, you're about to take a look at our event program for the whole of the year. Don't worry about all the colors other than the blue color on row 14. So on some Monday nights, we have a film club where we talk about a particular movie. So the first one we did was on Monday, January the 11th, on The Big Short, probably one of the most famous films. We had a lovely conversation about that film. And the reason I'm mentioning it now is because it's impossible to think about that film without thinking about what's happening within the cultures of the various organizations involved there. We then had one on Monday, February the 1st about Barbarians at the Gate, which is all about a massive leverage buyout. And again, it's impossible to think about that film without learning from and drawing on the cultural issues. On March the 1st, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. UK time, we've got The Laundromat, which is a wonderful movie in its own right. It's a great Meryl Streep film. And again, there are cultural dimensions to that too. On Monday, March the 15th, The Story of Nick Leeson, the man who brought down Barings Bank. That's kind of all about culture too. Then if you scroll forward to May the 10th, we've got Margin Call, an absolutely brilliant film, And there's a bit in it where basically there's this massive tension that builds between, do we do the right thing or do we do what's going to make us a lot of money? It's a superb part of the film. Monday, May the 24th, we've got The Boiler Room. You can imagine what that's all about. Then after June 28th, we've got Saving Capitalism. Then July the 12th, we've got Wall Street. Then after the summer, we've got The Wolf of Wall Street, two superb movies to talk about and discuss from this kind of perspective. Wagon Wheel, that's all about Wells Fargo Bank. There's a lot we can learn about culture from that movie. That's a Netflix film, excuse me. Then I think the last one for the year is The Inside Job, which is an amazing documentary about the financial services sector. And then, sorry, there's one more, Dirty Money, about the cartel bank. In fact, it's about HSBC, drug money, and all the rest of it. So there's loads of culture-related conversations that we can have off the back of those Monday night film club sessions. Hope that's going to be of some interest to you all. And they're all free to attend. You don't need to pay any money to attend. Just come along for the chat and share some ideas with like-minded people. So we've heard from John Dashfield. We've heard from Andy Axelay. We're now going to be hearing from Paul Moxey. He's going to be bringing us a strong academic perspective to this discussion. I believe that Paul's got some slides to share, so hopefully we'll get that sorted out shortly. So Paul, over to you. Thank you very much indeed. Wonderful to have you.
Hi there. Well, thanks, Andy. Thanks for inviting me to speak, and hello to everyone out there. Good evening, good day, good morning, whatever. Yeah, I've got some slides. Okay, so here we are. Big question mark, really. I've kind of taken a very close interest in corporate culture for 25 years, and probably more of an amateur interest before that. My background is as an accountant and a chartered secretary, and in risk management specialism and corporate governance, rather than financial services. I first got interested, I suppose, really interested in culture. I worked for a company where one of the directors ended up in jail along with a banker. Won't really go into the reasons why at this stage. I never really understood them myself. I was always told I didn't want to ask that sort of question when I wanted to know more. My job was just to do the accounts in those days. But when things go wrong in organizations, then it's usually to do with people in some way. If you look at the root cause of a risk, and every risk has a sort of an outcome, an output, but it's the root causes that really need to be treated, and you need to go back the whole way to think of what the root causes are. And usually it involves people in some way, and very often if people don't do the right thing, there's a cultural problem. People can make bad systems work, and people can make good systems fail. It's that simple, really. I got kind of interested in financial services when I was, well, I suppose before Northern Rock went bust. I studied Enron a great deal, and I joined in a global accounting body as their corporate governance and risk specialist. And I was struck by similarities between what was going on in banks at the time and what Enron had been up to. So a lot of close parallels. I wrote an article. Sadly, I couldn't get it published because of legal implications. But there are an awful lot of parallels. And just to kind of get us started in culture, this, I think Andy came from HBOS. This I found in the FCA PRA's publication on the failure of HBOS, which was their lengthy detailed report that came after the shorter one, An Accident Waiting to Happen, which is a good read as well. This is buried in page 207. So it would seem from that HBOS had a set of competencies which were used to appraise as executives, and Andy may recognize these, I don't know, and these are some of them. So the kind of things that HBOS wanted its executives to portray were courage, optimism, this is a really amazing one, believes the unbelievable and conveys to all around a sense of heroic optimism. And you can understand the kind of thinking that might have thought these are really good competencies for our executives to have. But when you look at it from a different perspective, you think how incredibly stupid that was. Easy with hindsight, but very difficult for a culture to follow risk, a culture to put people first, a culture to do the right thing ethically and so on. Difficult for that to exist if these are the kind of things that executives are appraised upon. What I wanted to talk about was really just a few things I've learnt over the years. And for quite a while, I used to think I had all the answers to all the big corporate problems. After a few years of not having published much apart from a textbook on corporate governance, I've now realised I've got far more questions than I've got answers. And I now know enough to be consciously incompetent on the whole subject. These slides will be available later, but if you wanted to look at any of these, you're welcome to. Corporate Governance and the Credit Crunch, we published in 2008, just as Lehman's failed. And it looked at, basically the reasons for the credit crunch as it was developing. And we identified all sorts of stress points. Flawed accounting, such as fair value, and the way costs are accounted for. Flawed flawed regulation, the way the Basel capital adequacy rules worked, seemed to contribute to the whole thing. Supervision didn't work very well. The whole system of incentives were completely flawed, and all that led to a very flawed culture within many banks. So it would have seemed from what came out. The next paper was a bit more in depth, risk and reward tempering the pursuit of profit, and I didn't write all of it. I wrote probably about 2/3 of it. Some of the learnings that I picked up later was really how difficult it is for regulators to do their jobs properly. They're caught between a rock and a hard place, particularly when governments were of the idea that the market knows best. It's a real challenge to be a good regulator. I've been reading a fascinating book recently called Non-Compliant, published by a lady called Carmen Segarra, who was who worked for the SEC, and she was she was responsible for part of the supervision of Goldman Sachs. And it would seem as if the SEC created every possible obstruction that they could to any of their supervisory staff doing their job properly in Goldman Sachs. So she became a whistleblower, and the book I've been reading is the book about it. Fascinating. Another thing that I thought was worth bearing in mind in risk, and you know, banking is all about getting risks right, and that in a way is their core strength. Whereas for most organisations, risks are things to be managed and avoided. In banking, risks are very much there to be taken, and to the extent you can do it better than other institutions, then you'll make more money. It's extraordinary then how poor risk management seemed to be, although there was a web page for Lehman's sometime after Lehman's went bust, where they really felt that their risk management was best in class. But then so did the regulators. The regulators thought Lehman's risk management was very good too. One of the points we made is that when thinking about risks, you really want to evaluate risk against the reward that you're going to make, and ideally the gains that you might make from taking a risk or several risks add up to more than the expected losses from those gains, taking into account long tail risks and so on. Put in another sort of lengthy paper called Creating Value Through Governance, and the essence of this really was that three things need to be in place for governance to work well. One was for companies to perform. Another one is for those who run the company to give account to those who theoretically have a capacity for holding those executives to account for doing their job properly. And then the third foundation, if you like, of a three-legged stool is that those to whom account should be given should be able to hold those executives to account. As the paper argued, that just does not work throughout the corporate governance chain, from individual savers to institutional investors to companies, to companies and their boards, to boards and their staff, or boards and the executives and executives and their staff. It just doesn't really work at all well. Not surprising, corporate governance doesn't work very well. So the kind of problems that people are trying to put right in corporate governance codes now are the same as the problems that they were trying to put right in 1992 when the Cadbury report came out. Then I managed to get ACCA to agree to get ERSRC funding to fund a much more detailed study into corporate culture, my great interest. And a number of papers are published. Here's one of them. You can search for, you can Google these and find them quite easily and download them. If you have any trouble, then just let me know. the key thing, I think, well, one of the key things from the culture study that really dawned on me after a while is that we all want a wonderful culture, but what do we mean by a wonderful culture? You could think that the things on the left in the slide here are things that you might want in a wonderful culture. Equally, you might think that the things on the right are what you might want in an ideal corporate culture. Probably most of us would think that the things on the left are better, but nevertheless, you're going to want some of the other ones. You're going to want rules and procedures. You're going to want rules. You're going to want accountability, and so on. But in practice, you can't just say, well, we want this, this, and this, and this, because when you do, you're going to end up making choices. So for an organization, or even for parts of an organization, you're going to want to try and find a right balance between having innovation and having control, between seeking risk and avoiding risk, between protecting the assets of the organization from the ability to produce things, from people's empowerment to exercise their common sense, or whether they need to be tied up in rules and procedures. The more rules and procedures you have, the harder it can be to exercise common sense, and so on. So generally, you're going to end up having to, when you think what kind of oops, I beg your pardon, trigger happy there. I'm not going to show you all these, don't worry. If you're choosing what kind of culture you want, try to think where you want to be on a continuum for these different areas. And I'm sure you'll be able to think of lots of other continuums. Well, I'm not sure what the plural of continuums is, but you'll be able to think of your own as well. And we hear a lot these days about assessing ethical culture, or assessing corporate culture rather. Well, assessing it's one thing, but you then need to try and compare that assessment with what you think you ought to have. And what you might want in a sales organization or a trading section of a financial services organization may be very different from what you might want in the compliance side or the accounting side or wherever. So where you want these X's will be different in different parts of an organization. I'm a great believer in attempting to assess your ethical culture as a prerequisite to assessing your culture more generally. And my background, from the sort of mid-90s onwards, has been one of being a practitioner, and then perhaps more of a theoretical person when I had less opportunity to do it in practice, of helping organizations to assess their effectiveness. And their effectiveness in relation to various things. And this particular diagram is about looking at an organization or an organization's effectiveness in relation to its ethics. And very simply, one would invite staff in a workshop, or it could be done online, but better done in a workshop, I think, to say whether they agree or disagree with various statements, such as at the very top, do we agree or disagree with the statement the board sets a good ethical example? In this particular example, the red line is set at number 4, and it's a 7-part Likert scale. So 7 would be strongly agrees. So and 1 is strongly disagrees. So 4 is the medium point. So if you see if the green shading, or rather, if you see any red, then that would suggest that the average score was less than 4, and so there's some disagreement with the statement, which is an indication of a possible risk. Now, these are average scores, and what gets really interesting is if you then look at what individual respondents have said, and very often what you'll find is that some people will agree strongly with the statement, but then you'll find a few who will disagree strongly. And then you can have a really interesting discussion with the people there as to why might some people disagree and why might some people agree strongly. That can uncover all sorts of fascinating things. And I would sort of commend that as a way of considering ethics to anyone interested in the subject, or in cultural assessment. Another paper I wrote was this one, Incentivizing Ethics, which was some research I did for Transparency International back in 2016. And as well as doing an awful lot of reading, I was asked to interview a number of compliance staff working for large international organizations about their views on whether or not incentives can lead to corruption. And it was about incentivizing corruption unintentionally. The report got turned around to incentivizing ethics because that was felt to be more positive. What struck me was when I was talking to these compliance staff, it was as if they had blinkers on. They didn't want to talk about any problems they had within their own organizations. They only wanted to talk about what they had done to make things better. And the blinkers, they seem to have a complete blindness, or willful blindness, I felt, to some of the problems that might be going on inside the organization. I guess it would have just made their jobs too difficult if they were to follow them up, and maybe it was not part of their remit or not what their bosses wanted them to do, and so on. I came across some fascinating research. One is about how you can have a good apple in a new, who joins an organization, but before long, if the organization is corrupt, it will quite quickly corrupt the good apple. It's a fascinating piece of research. I don't know if it's now being published, looking at corruption in the public sector in Greece. It was really enlightening. In terms of where we go from here, trying to look more positive, setting ethical targets as part of the performance targets that staff have as part of their performance management schemes would be a good idea. A really good idea is to try and align the system of incentives so that they contribute towards an individual achieving the goals of the organization. Easier said than done, of course, but actually to be aware that in practice, the way many organizations work, there's a whole set of informal or unofficial incentives that deter good behavior and encourage the kind of behavior that hits the headlines or makes for films in our film club. Assess ethics, a good idea. I suspect that most of the ways in which organizations are now assessing ethics aren't much good. But we're all kind of at the beginning of a learning curve. We're learning how to assess ethics, and there's going to be a lot of trial and error, and eventually we might come up with some really good ways of doing it. In the reward systems, as well as incentivizing ethics, focus on intrinsic rewards. This might not work in financial services, of course, but in most organizations, people are likely to be better motivated by intrinsic rewards, satisfaction of doing a good job, satisfaction from working with people they like, satisfaction from doing something good, rather than just making money. There's plenty of research that making money is a hygiene factor. It just doesn't work in parts of financial service when, as Andy was saying, you basically value yourself completely by how much money you're making for the organization. Whether that will ever change, who knows? I guess we can live in hope. And then the final point on there is discussing ethical dilemmas or discussing ethics is a really good thing to do in organizations. So if an organization actually creates the time and the space for employees to consider ethics or ethical dilemmas, preferably not real ethical dilemmas that they're facing, but perhaps hypothetical ones, which they might relate to what's going on in the organization if they so choose, but not necessarily. And what this does, it's a bit like, oh heavens, I've used this analogy for over 20 years, but it's actually particularly topical right now. It works like an inoculation against a virus, and because if you discuss ethical dilemmas with your colleagues, you'll fairly soon see who you might be in agreement with. It gives an opportunity for things that are unethical to surface and maybe make them less likely to happen. And the metaphor would be that it kind of discussing ethical dilemmas and discussing ethics in the workplace is a bit like creating the antibodies in an organization that surround ethical malpractice and help to eliminate it. I think that's probably a good point on which to finish. I've got some other slides which I think sort of supplement what I was saying, but I won't go through them now. So over to you, Andy.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Very thought-provoking stuff there. And I get your point in particular about this idea of conversations about ethics and doing the right thing in hypothetical scenario situations, almost kind of exercises the muscles, so to speak, that would be necessary to actually come into force in a real situation. You put it exactly in the same way that the antibodies in a vaccine might kind of work. That's a particularly timely way of looking at it. Thank you very much. I'll go to gallery view so I can see everybody in small thumbnails, and just wave at me if you'd like to make a point. We go to Richard Emery first of all. Thank you, Richard. Over to you.
Hi there. Thanks, Andy. A great evening discussing something that's really important. I just want to pick up a couple of things. Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. Now, I think, this has been mentioned, but I just want to come back to this, that if the CEO is required to produce shareholder value, then he's got to look at short-term numbers. And also a lot of CEOs in the financial services arena are actually going themselves to be incentivized in that they are shareholders and that's the way they get their bonus. So there's a lot of personal incentive. And that then drives down through the organization because they're saying to other people further down, you've got to do it this way because, and they are driven by shareholder value rather than purpose. So you will know I spend a lot of time challenging the banks to reimburse people. Of course, reimbursement costs money, therefore the banks resist doing it because it comes off the bottom line. And I think there's got to be that cultural sense of doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And I'll just say this, a long time ago, I worked for a very large organization. And one day I got a phone call from a director to say, Richard, can you please explain why last week you revealed confidential information that, and I sort of went, what do you mean? And he said, well, you know what was actually announced last night at the major meeting? And I went, no. And he went, well, what you were discussing last Friday or last Thursday and Friday in the bar in our social club actually is precisely what was announced last night. And therefore I believe that you knew about it and that you revealed confidential information. And I was genuinely shocked. And I went to my boss and I said, Philip, I didn't know this, but I've just had a phone call from this director. And Philip went, let me deal with it. A little while later, I got another phone call from the same director. Hi, Richard, I'm really sorry. I got it wrong. What had happened is my boss had gone to the chairman. The chairman had said, hang on a minute. We want our managers, our developing managers, to challenge, to think, to discuss. That's all this guy was doing. He just happened to get it right 2 days before we announced it. But the culture of the organization, was that I would be defended in what I had thought and what I had said, even though the timing of it was rather unfortunate. The point I'm making is my boss valued me. He valued me as an individual. And I think if you can get that through the whole organization, where we focus on we and we focus on the boss valuing me, there's a whole load of stuff there. Can I just pick up one point? Somebody did put a little note, Bazina Mikolovsky, and my apologies if I pronounced that wrong, said regulation works in the legal industry. Good lawyers live in the fear of breaching a regulation. I'm currently dealing with a case of a lawyer who broke the rules and ended up going to prison. And also, I have to say, because of the conversation Andy and I and others had this morning, regulation is not working in the financial services industry in the UK because the FCA is not an effective regulator. So, and it's not going to be regulation that's going to be fixing this. This is going to be fixed from within. The banks, the financial organizations have got to say, focus on our purpose of serving our customers rather than on shareholder value. Shareholder value will follow.
Thank you, Richard. Your comment just now reminds me that way back on August the 6th of May 2015, when I gave a talk at Senate House, London University, about the need for reform in financial services, I remember talking about this idea of a cultural transfusion. Imagine a blood transfusion. You know, somebody's sick, a blood transfusion. This industry, I believe, needs a cultural transfusion. Cast your mind back to what we were looking at about 10 past, 10 minutes into the conversation, when I was showing you that table. A table showing all the infringements by the financial services sector is roughly 7 times worse, 7 times more than the next worst offending industry, pharmaceuticals. There is something especially bad about financial services, and that's why we need to work so hard at this issue. And somebody said earlier, I think Paul said earlier that unless we fix the culture piece, nothing else is going to work. It was Peter Drucker, wasn't it, that said culture eats strategy for breakfast. And this speaks to the point that Paul Moxie made, that you can take a very good person, a very innocent person, a right-minded, ethical person, put him or her into a new organization where the culture's toxic, and it's just a matter of time before that person's good thinking gets contaminated by the interaction with those around them. Does anyone have any quick comments or questions to put to Paul before I start bringing the session to a close? Lee or Leah? Let me get it right. Should I say Lee or Leah? I'm never sure.
It's Leah.
Leah,
Yeah,
thank you
the
very
H
much.
is missing, but it's that way.
Thank you, Leah. Please do make your point. Thank you very much.
So I find it quite interesting what you just said about the kind of transfusion, because throughout the whole meeting, I was thinking, where does the culture actually start? Where does it actually come from? And how can we actually get anything new in there? And it probably is the young who actually start in the banks, in the investment firms, etc., etc. So kind of a bit what Anne-Marie was saying earlier as well, the kind of link there. So first of all, have that actually as part of the university education, not actually just about how to actually assess risk, etc., but actually make it an entire topic that culture is so important in this entire sector. But then also not necessarily just an oath to those who start or who actually work in there, but rather what would actually be if financial institutions, any bank, any financial business would actually make a kind of commitment to their graduates, to even their interns, that they can be safe in what they question, what they actually want to say, etc. So kind of really give an incentive, not so much to those who already are so established in this culture, but rather to those who are just entering fresh and who hopefully eventually will be the leaders and bring a bit of a fresh breeze in it.
I get your point. So well made, Leah. Thank you very much indeed. The idea of having fresh new talent entering the financial services with better expectations of their own conduct and better expectations of the conduct of those that have gone before them is really appealing. We really do need that. We really do need that. Thank you, Leah, very much. Would anybody else like to make a point at this stage? Andy, back to you, Andy Aikenhead.
Yeah, just a quick one. I mean, there's loads to be said about the education thing, but just going back to actually a point that Richard and it coincides with a point that Paul made around, Paul talked about intrinsic rewards, and any sports coach will know that the intrinsic rewards are far more powerful than extrinsic ones. And, that's where purpose comes in. It's really important that actually, if people are not clear on their purpose, they're going to be transactionally driven. And that's, where problems arise. It's also, and I know Campbell's not here anymore, but the senior management regime is all about telling people that they're accountable. And there's a difference between making people accountable and people stepping up and taking ownership or taking accountability. And essentially that's one of the things, you know, there's a real psychological difference about that. And that's, you know, that's one of the areas where problems arise.
Thank you, Andy, very much indeed. I'm going to invite Robert McNulty to briefly introduce himself. Robert, lovely to see you. Robert, please do introduce yourself and share with us any point you'd like to make on the topic of culture. I know you've been doing some staggeringly important work in related fields over the years. Robert, say hi to everybody and share with us a point you'd like to make. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Andy. It's great to see you again, and hello to everybody. I first had a career in international business, and then I spent the next couple of decades in academia focusing on ethics, initially more on the theoretical side or the experience, the psychology of ethics, and then for the previous 14 years on business ethics in particular. And I recently decided to leave my position. I was working at the Hoffman Center for Business Ethics at Bentley University, where I was the director of programs, and was working with the university and in terms of educational programs pertaining to business ethics, in many ways responding to Leah's point about trying to keep ethics front and center in the educational experience of our students. Bentley is a business university, and so we wanted to make sure that they had had that message repeated strongly and repeatedly throughout their time at the university. I decided to do something rather crazy. Bentley offered a very modest early retirement package to all the faculty and staff because, like so many universities, they were being pretty much devastated by the impact of the pandemic on university attendance. And even though it was not a very strong incentive, and even though we were in the midst of a pandemic, I was thinking that maybe it would be an opportunity to try to take some of my ideas and put them into practice. So I took the leap, and I'm in the process I set up a company, and the company is called Just Business. And there's a bit of a pun there because it might seem like only business, but in fact, my intention is just in the sense of being ethical or abiding by just principles. But one of the things that I took away from being in the field of business ethics for so many years is that there's a strong a predisposition that when we talk about the application of ethics in business, we're really talking about how do we keep people out of trouble. And a good compliance and ethics program, well, it used to be called Good Ethics Program, and then it became Ethics and Compliance, and it's pretty much in the United States, much more compliance driven. And this is across the board, not only in the financial services. But a good program is one in which at the end of the year, the people that are running the programs can show that there aren't too many instances of really bad behavior or illegal activities and things like that. I wanted to try to do something that I don't see being done, and that's maybe a good thing and maybe not such a good thing because I'm a little bit alone out here. But I wanted to really focus on what I'm calling positive ethics, rather than focusing on what one ought not to do, but to look at ethics from the perspective of those things that are actually uplifting, that are good, that are motivating, that are bring out the best in employees, and that bring our sources of pride and approbation, and see that can we look at a company and speaking of culture, do a bit of research into the culture to try to see not how they're failing so much, but maybe how they're not appreciating the potential for bringing out the best in their employees, and that their employees and their other stakeholders may have many gems that are not being mined because they're not looking in those areas. And so rather than saying, well, gee, you guys are screwing up here, and this is where there's corruption going on and so forth, it's like, there's some great ideas being among your employees. There's even your other stakeholders outside the company have ideas connected to your company that are available to you and could really strengthen your company, but you haven't really been asking the right questions. And
Robert, that's
the idea.
Yeah, Robert, these are wonderful ideas. It's going to be great to see how they pan out in practice and how you manage to get this idea of positive ethics established. It's a great idea. I love the idea of organizations actually focus on encouraging people to do the right thing and thinking the right thing. Robert, thank you very much. We are going to be bringing things to a close shortly. For me personally, I want to, of course, thank our speakers. We've had Professor Paul Moxey, we had Andy Aikenhead, we had John Dashfield. Remember, folks, the key points that I kicked off with, this idea that there is something peculiarly wrong with the financial services sector in terms of the amount of malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct and mis-selling that goes on. That really does need to change. If it doesn't change, the industry is going to get a poorer and poorer reputation as time goes by. It will have less and less trustworthiness. Consumers are going to become more and more skeptical, more and more anxious, more and more concerned about being ripped off and all those negative things. And I guess the final point I want to make is that from the way I see it, we all have a part of a collective responsibility to demand more of ourselves and to demand more of those around us. So unless anybody has anything that itching to say before we wrap the session up, we'll bring things to a close shortly. Just wave at me if you do want to say anything before we do so. Otherwise, we're going to be bringing things to a close pretty shortly. I think we'll do that. So, Mr. John Dashfield, thank you for your speaking slot, sir. Andy Aikenhead, thank you for yours. Professor Paul Moxey, thank you for yours as well. It's been a great session, lots to think about. Thank you all very much. Let's give ourselves a collective round of applause for spending some quality time talking about some very, very important issues. Thanks all.